On a night when every other driver looked away, one tired mechanic chose to stop. He had no idea this single. Two strangers, stranded and freezing, watched a man they had never met work like their night still mattered to someone.
He didn't ask for a name. He didn't ask for a reward. In a world that keeps driving past, he simply knelt down in the storm.
The engine caught. The rain kept falling. But for the first time that night, someone finally exhaled.
The rain had not let up in 3 hours, and Daniel Carter was beginning to think the sky itself was trying to tell him something. He liked to imagine it that way sometimes. Clouds as tired old men complaining, thunder as a foreman barking orders nobody wanted to hear. It was a small, private joke, he told himself, on nights like this, when the world felt too quiet to bear alone. If you have ever driven home on a road nobody else seemed to be using, if you have ever felt invisible doing something you knew mattered, then stay with this story until the end, because what happened on that stretch of Route 9 outside Millbrook would remind him, and might remind you too, that kindness rarely announces itself before it changes everything. If this story moves you, consider liking the video and subscribing, because there are many more stories like Daniel's still to tell. Daniel was 44 years old, and for the last 6 of those years he had run Carter's Auto on the edge of town. A squat cinderblock garage with 2 bays and a hand-painted sign that had faded from red to a dusty pink. Before that, he had been an aerospace maintenance technician for a regional airline, the kind of job that paid well and asked for nothing but his soul in return. When the company downsized and his position vanished in a single email, he had taken what little severance remained and poured it into the garage, determined to build something that could not be taken from him by a spreadsheet. His daughter Emily was 12 now, bright and quick-tongued, living with him full-time since her mother had moved out west 2 years earlier chasing a different life. Daniel did not resent her for it. He simply adjusted, the way he adjusted to everything, quietly, without complaint, the way a man learns to live around a bad knee. That evening, he had stayed late at the shop finishing an oil change for a regular customer, and by the time he locked up, the rain had turned the parking lot into a shallow, restless lake. He should have gone straight home. Emily was at her friend's house for the night, and there was leftover chili waiting in the fridge, and a couch that had been calling his name since 6 in the morning. Instead, something made him take the long way, out past the old grain silo and onto Route 9, a road he rarely used because it added 20 minutes to his drive. He would later tell himself it was because of the flooding on Main Street. He would also quietly admit it might have been something else, some instinct he had learned not to question. He saw the hazard lights first, blinking weakly through the downpour like a heartbeat struggling to keep time. A silver sedan sat crooked on the shoulder, hood popped, steam curling up into the rain. 2 figures huddled beneath a small umbrella near the guardrail, and even from a distance, Daniel could see the umbrella was losing the fight against the wind. He slowed his truck, then stopped, then sat there for a moment the way people do when they are deciding whether to be the kind of person who gets involved or the kind who simply drives on. He had been both kinds before, at different points in his life, and he was old enough now to know which one let him sleep at night. He pulled onto the shoulder behind them, hazards blinking in rhythm with theirs, and stepped out into the storm without a plan beyond helping. The 2 young women turned as he approached. Sisters, it would turn out, Claire and Bethany, both in their early 20s, on their way back to college after a weekend visiting their grandmother 2 towns over. Claire had her arms wrapped tightly around herself, teeth chattering, while Bethany kept glancing nervously down the empty road, the kind of dervis that comes from being a young woman alone on a dark highway with a stranger walking toward her. Daniel understood that fear immediately, and he made himself smaller in response, the way he had learned to do over years of being a large man in small rooms. He kept his hands visible, his voice low and unhurried, and simply said that he ran the garage in town and wanted to see if he could help, and that they were welcome to call anyone they wanted while he looked, and that he would not take it personally if they preferred to wait for someone else. It was Claire who finally nodded, some tension leaving her shoulders, and pointed toward the hood. The engine had died without warning on a straight stretch of road. No warning lights, no strange sounds, just a sudden and total silence. Daniel asked permission before touching anything, then leaned into the engine bay with the small flashlight he kept in his truck door, rain running down the back of his neck in cold rivulets. It took him only a few minutes to find the problem. A corroded battery terminal, likely made worse by the flooding, the connection finally giving out from years of slow neglect. It was not a hard fix. Not for a man who had once serviced turbine engines at 30,000 feet, but it required tools he did not carry in his truck and hands steady enough to work in a downpour without losing feeling in his fingers. He drove the short distance back to his shop, promised he would return within 20 minutes, and left his own hazards on as a strange, silent assurance that he intended to keep his word. Bethany would admit later that she had fully expected him not to come back, that stories like this usually ended with two girls alone on a dark road, learning a hard lesson about trust. But Daniel returned exactly when he said he would, tools in hand, rain jacket dripping, and got to work without another word about it, because to him, keeping a promise was not something that deserved praise. It was simply the baseline. He worked for the better part of 40 minutes, kneeling on wet asphalt that soaked through his jeans within the first 5, his fingers slowly losing their warmth as he stripped the corroded terminal, cleaned the connection, and wrapped it with a fresh clamp he had grabbed from his own inventory without mentioning the cost. Claire held the flashlight for him near the end, an unspoken shift from fear to trust that neither of them acknowledged out loud. When the engine finally caught and roared back to life, all three of them let out something between a laugh and a long-held breath, and for a moment the rain did not feel quite so cold. Daniel refused payment. Bethany insisted, pulling out her wallet with hands that still trembled slightly from the cold, but he waved her off, telling her the only thing he asked was that they text their parents to let them know they had gotten home safe, and maybe pay it forward to someone else on some other rainy night. It was such a small thing to say, and yet it landed on both sisters like something far heavier, a kind of decency they had begun to believe was mostly gone from the world, especially from strangers on empty highways after dark. What Daniel did not know, as he stood there dripping and exhausted and already thinking about the chili waiting at home, was that Bethany had quietly taken a photo of him working under the hood, planning only to send it to her mother as proof they were safe. She had not planned for her mother, a local news producer 2 counties over, to see something more in that image, a humble man kneeling in the rain for 2 strangers who could offer him nothing in return. Nor did Daniel know that Claire, an aspiring journalist herself, had jotted down the name of his shop from the faded lettering on his truck door, intending only to leave a good review online, never imagining it would become the opening line of a much larger story. 3 days later, Daniel was elbow-deep in a transmission when Emily burst into the garage waving her phone, breathless, insisting he had to see something. He wiped his hands, expecting some viral video of a skateboarding dog, and instead found a local news segment with nearly 200,000 views, titled simply, "The Mechanic Who Stopped." It featured Bethany's photo, a short interview with both sisters, and a quiet, understated profile of Daniel himself, his years at the airline, the layoff, the garage he had built from nothing, the daughter he was raising alone. He sat on an overturned bucket and watched the whole thing in silence, Emily's hand resting on his shoulder, feeling something unfamiliar rise in his chest, something between embarrassment and a strange, aching pride. The calls started that same afternoon. Some were customers, drawn in by the story, wanting an honest mechanic they could trust. Some were local businesses offering sponsorships he barely understood how to accept. And then, near closing time, his phone rang with a number he did not recognize, and on the other end was Claire, her voice warm and a little nervous, explaining that she and Bethany wanted to properly thank him, not with money, which he had already refused, but with dinner, if he and his daughter were willing. "We want to see you again," she said, "not because of the video, but because people like you shouldn't just disappear back into the rain." Daniel found himself smiling in a way he had not in longer than he could remember, and he told her that Emily would probably talk their ears off about airplanes if given the chance, and Claire only laughed and said that sounded perfect. In the months that followed, Carter's auto grew steadily busier, not because Daniel changed anything about how he worked, but because the story had simply reminded people what honest work looked like when no one was watching. He and the sisters stayed in touch, an easy, unforced friendship built on nothing more than gratitude and shared humanity. Occasional dinners where Emily talked at length about jet engines while Claire and Bethany listened with genuine delight. Daniel never sought out the attention, never leaned into the small fame that followed him, and if anything, it made people trust him more. He remained, at his core, the same quiet man who had once been let go by an email and rebuilt himself one oil change at a time, the same man who still believed that some nights, on some empty roads, stopping the car was the only decision that ever really mattered. And long after the video views slowed and the calls became ordinary again, what stayed with everyone who heard the story was not the fame or the attention, but the simple, radical idea that decency, offered freely and without expectation, has a way of finding its way back to you when you least expect it. Sometimes in the form of 2 strangers on a rainy highway, saying the 6 words that changed everything. "We want to see you again."